Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the SportsPro Podcast. I am your host, Tom Bassam, and in this week's episode, we're going to be covering one of our major projects over here at SportsPro HQ. This week saw the launch of the latest Laureus Sport for Good Index, our annual showcase which shines a light on the brands that have a meaningful societal impact on their work through sport. Now, in order to add to our index and make it sing, we gathered up the views of an esteemed judging panel to add 11 new names to the index this year, with the companies included judged to have made an impact across the United Nations' 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And these were assessed via a rigorous process against 5 key selection criteria by our judges. And the names that got added are pretty stellar. They include Decathlon, Dove, Adidas, Eon, Lidl, Minute Media, Novelis, Puma, Red Bull, Tentree, and Xbox. These were all the brands that were honoured this year, and that takes the total up since we launched the index 4 years ago to 76 brands. Now, the reason we do this is, as I said at the top, to highlight the brands that are having a meaningful impact through change, but also showcase to others in the sports industry how they could do similar. So I thought, as an interesting exercise for this week's podcast, that we would continue with that theme. And I'm lucky enough to be joined by one of the judges for this year's index, who is Katie Cross. She is the CEO of Pledgeball, which is a sustainability in sports advocacy group. And in today's episode, we're going to be creating a fictional new early stage brand company that has identified sport as a significant area for our marketing spend. And they want to create some consumer affinity through social impact. Now, 2 people are not quite enough to set such a significant strategy. So I've asked Gunnar Hagstrom, who is the head of strategic partnerships at Laureus, to help us and provide some expertise from the kind of people we actually want this brand to be working with. Now, obviously, this is a bit of a tough ask in a podcast episode. I think that would be a challenge for any company, really, especially with a working board who aren't altogether familiar. But what follows is our best attempt to come up with a brand strategy using Sport for Good. I hope you enjoy it. Katie Cross, Gunnar Hagstrom, welcome to the SportsPro Podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. This isn't actually a podcast anymore. What I've convened here is a strategy meeting amongst some very key executives. The reason why we've all been called around this beautiful boardroom, or this beautiful virtual boardroom, is that we're an early stage business startup. We've identified sport as a pretty significant area that we'd like to put our marketing into, and part of that is we want to create an affinity through social impact. Look, obviously the backdrop to this is that SportsPro and Laureus released its combined Sport for Good index this week. We've added a bunch of new brands to it. It's really, really exciting. But I wanted to kind of think about how, if we were setting something up, we would maybe get ourselves onto that index. So maybe I'll start this with you, Katie. You can kick us off in this wonderful boardroom. If we were going to sort of start from the beginning with this, we're a brand, we're a company. How would you best place yourself, best position yourself to be successful as a sort of sports for good brand, a brand in this area? What would you be doing? What would be your first steps?
I would definitely be drawing up a framework. I mean, essentially, and maybe this is different for other people, certainly some organisations I look at, it must be different. But I kind of think, what is the point of not framing, particularly if you're starting a startup, around a way to have a purpose and have a genuine social impact? So I think what I'd probably first do is actually pull together a load of people from different areas, different stakeholders, fans, employees within the company, different advisors, and basically really find out what it is that matters to them. The other thing I'd do is definitely look at climate justice framing. There's a great podcast I listened to recently. They just had 4 questions they framed it around. One was, who's missing from the room when you have these conversations? The second was, what harm am I doing to anybody else? So that's a global question. The third is, what benefits can I genuinely bring to this? And I can't remember the fourth, but I'll have to look it up for you. And I picked something for tea. But that's what I do, is go about some simple questions that essentially then lead into the values of the organisation.
Maybe coming at this from a slightly different perspective, what kind of brand, maybe taking on from what Katie said there, is best placed to have this kind of impact? Or does that even matter? Is it just about values, really?
I think the biggest thing is values. I think talking to different groups and partnerships, like understanding why it really matters to them is the most important thing. It doesn't matter exactly what kind of brand they are. Like at their core, does it matter? Do they want to kind of invest? It doesn't have to be financial, although that help, but do they really want to get behind this for the long term? We want to be looking at groups who want to get behind this work, not for a photo, not for 6 months, but something where they want to get behind this for the long term.
And if we're sort of, as you said, Katie, if we're looking around the room and we're looking at who's not there right now in that brand space?
I mean, if we're talking about climate specifically, for example, we often don't see those within those nations that are, being directly hit by climate. They're not in the room. They're not in the room to influence it. So, Faith for Nature, right, is a really good example of an organisation that's gone out of its way to do this because they have a solicitor on the board who represents nature. And so they've got no vested interest other than to represent nature. That kind of thing makes sure that there is a spokesperson for nature in that sense. I think if we look closer to home, it obviously depends on where the brand is actually activating, I guess. So where they're carrying out this impact. You have to have people in the room, and it's not rocket science, but if you get them in the room, the insights that come because of the inherent understanding they have of the community means that it's naturally going to be far more impactful. And to Gunnar's point, it's going to have that long-lasting impact because they will have fed in and they have a natural vested interest in it.
So then for the sort of merits of this conversation, it doesn't matter particularly where our brand is, what it is we do. It's probably best if we're not like an airline or an oil business. But how about if we say we're a brand and we're based in let's say South America, a developing country there, where climate change is a really big issue. You're dealing with lots of external pressures. Would that help? Do you think that would bring that voice into that room, Gunnar? Is that the right way to go? Is that the right place for our brand to be?
I think it's always useful, right? Like I think it's a great opportunity if you're engaging at the local level and using kind of the example you just gave. If you're kind of listening to those that are impacted, to give them an opportunity to help kind of inform what their needs are, what their obstacles are, what the challenges are, and take that information into your strategy, I think it's a fine way to go. I know, Kay, I'd be curious from your side, from kind of the branding side, where and how that fits.
I mean, so when we work with clubs, for example, the initial thing we always suggest is that they set up a working group that involves many stakeholders, including and especially fans, because they are in the local community. So if, for example, we're looking at Brazil, which has been really impacted, obviously, by floods, a lot of the clubs over there have been flooded, and therefore it's provided this kind of real instigator to use that moment to drive for change. And so, great. But I think the risk here is that a brand could swerve in and go, this looks like a great place because I could have loads of impact. Yes, brilliant. But make sure that it's done in a way that really does resonate with the local community. There was an interesting interview I saw from someone who'd been hit by floods in Valencia recently. And it didn't mean that climate change was any more up their agenda directly, because actually they were just trying to get by on the day to day. But in order to fully understand that, you have to have those people in the room. And you can frame climate and sustainability through that by addressing those things that are immediate problems to them. In this country, often within the UK, it's obviously cost of living, cost of heating. And of course, addressing those primarily has then an impact with regards to sustainability. So I just always insist that you make sure that those people are all in the room and have a real genuine voice within the establishment of the values of the brand, if we're talking about a startup, or to determine what the intervention looks like.
Some of the best examples we have in working with partners, there's an apparel brand in the US who's really hyper-focused on investing in increasing education and employment pathways, particularly for the Black community in the US. And I think what they did really well was it was ingrained within their kind of internal stakeholder base, but it also, they went out to their kind of customer base as well, right? And they really did an incredible job of incorporating feedback from all different levels to really help build out what their kind of impact strategy was going to be and make it not tokenistic, but something that is like real and sells within all of the different levels of the organization.
I think that leads me quite nicely onto, I think, the second part of this meeting. What are the building blocks that you need to put in place to be a successful brand if this is the social impact you're trying to have? Is it a personnel, team leadership thing? Like, as you said, Katie, like it's getting the right people in the room, but how do you make sure that you've got the structure within your startup, within your company to deliver on your goals?
I mean, I think there's a few things there. One is obviously people and buy-in across the business, and particularly board level buy-in. More and more I see the importance of relationships within this and personal advocacy. For example, there's a really leading sports organization And the only reason they're leading in climate sustainability is because over 10 years ago now, one individual in there who was a project manager chose to drive climate and sustainability because it was a personal concern to him. And now it infiltrates all of the businesses, that belong to this particular sports rights holder. And it goes up to director level. So there's that. And then you have to put the structures in place to ensure that those values perpetuate throughout the organization. So, as Gunnar said, having structures in place allow constant feedback. Somebody at Sky told me that they had an app at one point in time where when they were deciding on a new partnership, they basically sent it out to all employees via this app, and the employees would vote on it. And they often put it in the framing of, how would your kids feel if we partnered with this organization? Because it put things in perspective and brought a personal lens to it. But of course, you have to have those structures. So, the vision, mission, values that really, then actually are implemented to make sure that that is maintained, that those personal points are maintained. And the last thing I'd point out is that you definitely need someone who doesn't benefit financially from it on the board to essentially make sure those values are maintained, even when it's not the easiest financial course.
Anything you'd add there, Gunnar? At the moment, I feel like we're pitching towards having a sort of a chief sustainability officer who's got their own department within our brand. It might cost us a little bit more. We might need to go back out for an additional funding round to make sure we've got this covered. But to me, it sounds like it's worth it.
Listening to Katie, I was giggling to myself a bit because one of my first experiences in the charitable space was an influential person at a big company who really was behind the mission and was able to kind of unlock the resource, right, to get it out. But they kind of put into our organization, to communities and so on and so forth, but never was able to put the structures around it. And the second that person moved on, everything that person was building kind of crashed to the ground, right? And so I think the buy-in and the ability to put some kind of frameworks around it, which Katie said, as I think in her first statement, that's how you get some of the longevity for this work and the wider buy-in. And then there's ways to allow the work to resonate with your employee base and your wider stakeholder base as well. But the organizational buy-in behind just the person waving the big flags is critical.
Obviously, you've got a top-down leadership approach here where you've got someone at the very top making sure that it comes all the way through. But what if other people aren't following them? How do you make sure that everyone is sort of on board with this mission, even within that, even if you've got that structure set up?
I mean, really, that's about people management, isn't it? At Pledgeball, we have a very big team of volunteers, which is a natural filtration process because people are giving of their free time, but it's incredible and incredibly efficient because everybody is bought in and they're only in there for those reasons. And then as we've added staff, we've been lucky enough to have similar, but I partly think that that's the culture of the organisation that exists. They work with these volunteers who are willing to giving their free time. But back to what Gunnar said, we have frameworks, we have determined values, we share them a lot. That's the other thing. I mean, communication around all of this is absolutely key, both internally, so that everybody is aware of the values, the point of one piece that you're doing and how that works towards your values or your mission, but also externally. I mean, I think you can have as much impact or lose as much impact by just doing something quietly. We've learned this by just doing something quietly but properly, but not communicating about it properly, because then you bring along other people with you.
Obviously, with Pledgeball, you guys are coming out from a position where that's your whole company's ethos, right? But if we're this mythical startup from South America and we've got a lovely chief sustainability officer, that is one part of what we do as a business. Is there anything else extra that we can do to put in place to make sure that their goals, their priorities aren't lost amongst the other commercial aims of the company?
I mean, it goes back to the board piece, having somebody on the board that has as much say as others. But I think the other thing that can be really helpful is to separate those things that bring an ROI in financial terms and those things that don't, but fit the mission. And then you can attack, but then you can look at those and say, well, actually, have we missed something here? Is it going to add a commercial ROI? Are we therefore more attractive to, sports rights holders? We're hearing much more that there's commercial demand for addressing social problems. We can see that very clearly. So it's just making sure, I think, that we know exactly the ROI on every single piece. And actually, if there's something we want to do that fits our mission, but maybe really doesn't have an ROI, maybe we figure out a way of funding that, the resourcing that year. And because it's planned, it's not going to suddenly hit. And there's a debate about whether to carry it out or not.
Good. If I can just treat you as an external consultant for a second, when you're working with brands that want to be in this space and you sort of get on your Zoom calls, you have your meetings, What have you recognised that's worked with those kind of organisations? And that you don't have to name any names here, but and what have you seen that where you've been like, this is why this hasn't quite got the way we wanted it to?
Where we often struggle is just a bit of a misalignment on the actual kind of changes that we hope to happen as a result. And I think Katie's talked about some of these pieces around like, is someone getting a financial benefit from XYZ at the end, right? That can skew things in different directions. Like an example that's worked really well is following George Floyd in the US. The employee base, because something you mentioned earlier, Tom, and you were picking up from our conversation, like a lot of these changes come top down. The employee base of Gatorade said, we want to make a change, right? And they have a significant kind of base in the Minnesota region, and their employees all kind of galvanized and kind of pushed the conversation up. And then part of the conversation then came back to Laureus to then work through a way we could partner to hit on all the different things that they wanted to achieve as a brand, but it was really centered around the changes they wanted kind of from a society. So I think that's kind of the ideal, but where things have been misaligned is often when things get overly politicized, when there's additional people in the room, right, that maybe you don't see, but that have influence, but haven't actually like voiced their opinion until it's too late. Like oftentimes people kind of come into the conversation late and steer things in kind of a direction that we don't necessarily want. And then it gets really messy. And you've got to really work for a while to kind of get everybody back on the same page.
And taking this back to our brand's marketing focus, is there a merit in making this basically the entirety of what we do in terms of our marketing, in terms of how we position ourselves? Or should we split it, basically? Should we go, look, we can allocate this much resource to this? Or should we go, no, look, I think the benefits here are way bigger if we just go all out on this social impact kind of positioning?
I mean, anecdotally and from early research, I would suggest you put it all in social impact. I mean, the resonance that those kind of interventions have and the story that can be told are so significant. You know, you then have a deeper, longer lasting connection with your consumer base as well, because it truly matters. You remember that. Also, they don't need to be mutually exclusive. You know, a lot of your traditional marketing will be included within that. I mean, we did a campaign with MasterCard and UEFA around the Champions League in the summer. It was around engaging fans around climate and sustainability. We worked with PhD students to ensure genuine impact, but we did it, you know, we had the PR team working on it, and it was a hugely, hugely successful PR campaign. And it told a wonderful story. But a lot of that was down to the fact that it had genuine impact as well. And therefore it resonated, and it resonated with how people genuinely felt. So it told a story within that. It had that emotive point to it. So I would definitely suggest putting it all in these social impact campaigns, but having that PR kind of filter on it to ensure that both sides are being worked on.
I think the authenticity of the messages, I think that is what really resonates, right?
I mean, I'm just looking at like some of the brands that have been included in this. Is Index and Tentree is one of them, obviously, but it's kind of gone in completely on this positioning. Patagonia, another, and it does work, right? As you said, you get authenticity through that, and that means that you will naturally pick up a certain type of consumer. We don't know what our brand is. We do know where it's based roughly. We do know kind of what the structure is. And we do know now what it looks like where we're spending all of our marketing budget. So we could probably move on to where some of this is going to go. So we're going to need to find a cause that we're going to put this budget behind. Have either of you two got any good ideas for where we should be putting this?
I reckon you should combine what Gunnar said earlier with climate. So you talked about skilling up people, but let's skill people up for the green transition. And let's identify those people who need jobs, and let's identify the skills that they're going to require for the jobs in the future.
I like it. If we're coming at this from a sort of, this is where my lack of South American knowledge is really going to fall apart, and perhaps that we should rethink our HQ. But I guess there's plenty to go on there, right? There's a lot of causes in which we could take this into.
Climate is a good place to start. I think we look at everything. There's so much kind of intersectionality all over the place. But there's an interesting company we've been having lots of different conversations with called Greenfos, which make like water pumps. And their whole thing has been around like clean water. And now they're thinking about, okay, once people's needs of clean water have been met, then what are some of the things those young people can do? And so it's also an interesting way to think about it. Once we kind of get some of the work around climate under control, right, then there's a space for young people to play and experience other kind of outcomes from that as well.
Sorry to interrupt your podcast, but as we're in the middle of talking about it, it's probably a good time to let you know where you can find out a little bit more about the Laureus Sport for Good Index. Now, we're thrilled to announce earlier this week the long-awaited 2024 additions to the Laureus Sport for Good Index. This is the fourth consecutive year we've been running this project, and it's a really nice opportunity to highlight all the brands that are making a positive impact through their campaigns in sport. If you want to find out a little bit more about some of the brands in this year's list and how they managed to get there, you can download the full index now at sportforgoodindex.sportspro.com. I'll put the link to that in the episode description, so you can find it basically wherever you're listening to this podcast. Right, let's go back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Well, I think we've got roughly where we're going with this in terms of the cause. Now, like, if we're going to pick a sport to go through, like if we're in South America, is it only football, or is there another option that's perhaps maybe a bit more locally focused? Or are we really just like cutting off our nose to spite our face here and just say, let's go to football?
I think when it comes down to the actual tool or sport, I don't actually think it matters that much. Depending on the region you're in, some sports carry significant stigmas with them. So if we happen to be doing this in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, football is heavily dominated by boys and really kind of hard for girls to crack into. Finding something that, depending on what you're trying to achieve, right, it can be a variety of different sports, but you want to look at, what are some of the different stigmas that follow some of those sports. For time of climate, we probably don't want to be doing motor car racing. I'm right. Like, you want to make sure you're choosing something that fits into those pieces and is culturally relevant.
And of course, our advisory board of people from the local community are going to tell us anyway.
So lucky we've got in place those excellent building blocks, because otherwise we'd be really struggling about now. But that's fine. We're a really well-run startup with loads of funding. It's remarkable. I think it's kind of circle it back to where we were right at the start. Like, it is interesting, isn't it, that it doesn't actually seem to matter what your brand is or what the sport is. But if you can join up all of those other parts, you can still find success if you've got the other bits in place.
I'd argue against that. It does matter what your brand is. I have heard stories of brands going in and doing work around water when actually the factory that they produced is the one that drains a lot of the water from the local environment. It does definitely matter what the brand is. I think where you can kind of move away from historical issues is look at why the brand is doing it. Is it in line with their internal policies? Are they also moving towards that? Or are we just cleaning up their image and actually undeservedly so? So I would definitely say that who the brand is does matter.
Okay, so what the brand is does matter, but the sport is less important.
Sport is less important. The brand does matter.
Excellent. Right, well, let's move on to the delivery of this. We're leaning on our advisory board a little bit here, but what are the best methods and strategies for a brand to collaborate with existing stakeholders in order to get the results that they want?
Listening, that's incredibly vague and obtuse, I know, but it's the most powerful thing. And then, working across, figuring out where are the different skill sets and assets right in the community. So you're going to have a lot of existing kind of partners on the ground already doing amazing work. And so where you don't need to replicate, you partner. And I think it's really around doing like a proper kind of asset mapping to really build on the strengths of the community versus oftentimes we look at things through like a deficiency lens. And so the more we're doing kind of a proper mapping of that, like you can find the really strong group that you can kind of then build through.
I'd agree. I mean, really it is ensuring that you have those working groups in place that can support you. But also, you have to make sure the structures are there. So, it's very easy saying, well, let's collaborate and bring everybody in. But there has to be the resources to enable that. And it has to be very clear on what grounds and what everybody gets out of it, because that's just how it works in practice. But those discussions can happen both in advance and preparation and then be finalised with that working group. But you're right. I mean, just actually resourcing that, taking the stock moment where you're doing a proper review, audit of everything that's already in place and building upon that is absolutely crucial.
And I guess that also includes the local people and the sort of the existing stakeholders in that area that you've got to work with, because the danger, of course, is that you run into some people who actually aren't necessarily out there to align with the brand that you want. They're just out trying to get some of that money for yourself.
100%. I mean, it really is about capacity building within that local environment.
Okay, then, so we're pretty happy. We've done our audit. We've got our local stakeholder. We think we've got our partnership in place. What is it then that generates like a lasting impact? What is it that sort of isn't a sort of one and done? We're going to just do this for a nice photo op and get out of here. Like, does it go back again all the way to those structures and making sure that you have regular check-ins? Is it communication? Is it all of those things?
It's making sure that actually what you're doing is essentially supporting those who are already there, who are locals, who are the movers and shakers in that world, to enable them to get involved so that you're co-designing a project that then has legs beyond that particular activation or that period of time that you're there for. And if you've got that feed in, and you're enabling that to happen, you're looking at all aspects of that. Is it that we need to skill people up locally? Is it that we need to provide some form of financial support for a certain period of time? Is it that we commercialize this and support them in commercializing it, so then it's self-sustaining? It is essentially doing that co-development so that when you go, you don't need to be there anymore. Your purpose is defunct, but what you've left is there and is working and is running.
Everything Katie just said is 100% correct. If even when you think about, depending on how we set up this high impact company in South America, there's also a way to, as Katie talked about, you're bringing people together. The funding is helpful, but the funding is just one small piece to it. So to the sustainability, there's also ways to empower the actual local formation of groups, right? So that they actually take on long-term ownership, and that's got to come up kind of from the bottom up. But there's lots of different kind of pieces you can put together to support the vision of sustainability. But what we know is it doesn't come from just like one piece of funding. That can help be the catalyst for getting some of the work going. I mean, getting some of the people around the table sometimes, but it's not what keeps the work going.
Okay, we've talked about some do's. What are the don'ts then in this delivery phase?
It's like the opposite of that framing we had at the beginning. Are you causing damage to anyone? So don't cause damage to anyone. I think would be a don't.
Like, how do you know that?
This is the thing. I mean, you won't know for certain, but even just going through that series of questions, like, is our activity right now going to harm anybody? Makes you then consciously consider a whole range of people. Impacts that exist from just beyond that own kind of localization as well. So even that framing is helpful. Don't just dive in and just dictate, involve local groups as we've talked about, and don't do it in a way that you feel slightly uncomfortable with. If you're going in there and thinking, I'm doing this, but actually we're not living up to what we're kind of preaching through this one campaign or this one activation, then make sure that things are then taken internally, and your company itself is looking at how they can shift internally so it aligns with what you're trying to achieve through this particular activation.
If it feels a bit shallow, right? Like when you're in it, if you can kind of feel it in your gut a bit, everybody else can feel in it too. And then I think that's a basic kind of humanistic barometer. But I think a lot of times groups throw money at problems and try to put kind of like band-aids on things. And that's literally what they're doing. They're putting a small band-aid on something by throwing a bit of money, taking a picture, and then a year later they're gone. I think that's what we don't want to do. That's what we want to avoid doing.
And I would say don't make assumptions either. Make sure that you get an external consultant in. You get that person who's not afraid to critique what you've done properly to ensure that it genuinely is working.
All right, okay, we've got through this delivery phase. We've got our successful partnership on the ground. We're up and running. The comms look great. Yeah, the Instagram's firing. The TikTok looks incredible. We're getting a lot of positive feedback. How do we make sure we're measuring the right things and communicating the right things, both internally and externally?
I definitely say you employ somebody externally to do it, who is an expert in the field initially. So in terms of assessment, I definitely employ somebody externally because they don't have the skew from working within the company and benefited from a company and having that person wish for it to succeed. In terms of communications, involve the experts, involve those who communicate best within that local community or whoever you're actually communicating with. I know we keep going back to climate, but if we're talking about climate and climate framing, I mean, the whole issue with climate at the moment is communication and the way in which it's communicated. We look at Trump, we look at his simple messages. I think there's a lot to learn around the most effective way to communicate. He's understood actually what that initial barrier is, keep it simple and make it resonate with people.
I think there's in the beginning of strategy initiative, kind of bring people on the table from a measurement standpoint. I think it's engaging the various groups into actually like collaborating on the development of your kind of evaluation framework. There's a level of accountability that then goes kind of in multiple different directions. And then you're aligned that, hey, this is what everyone said the results are, right? These are the changes we want to see. So at the end, right, or ideally not at the end, Tom, because this is going to keep going and going and going. But at 18 months, 24 months, whatever, there's bringing in external people also at the beginning phase to kind of evaluate the process, create the proper kind of feedback loops to tweak things where it might be off track in terms of the roadmap that the whole group kind of described we want to get to, I think is really important. This is really an overly simplified way of thinking about success. That if you're doing real community work, the success is the people on the ground saying, we want this to keep going, right? Like this is important to us. We want this to keep going. We want to keep working with you. That's probably not going to get you your massive government funding contract.
Or a huge uptick in sales of whatever it is we're trying to flog to the consumer.
Or a huge uptick in sales that you're trying to flog to the consumer. No, I think that in a short term, right? If you're looking at things in the first couple of years, like them wanting you still there doing this work is quite a level of success.
You look like you disagree with that slightly, Katie.
No, I was just reflecting really. I think I personally feel quite nervous when we only use internal frameworks. I mean, I agree. A framework provides that structure. You've got agreed metrics. As Gunnar said, you brought in many stakeholders to agree on those metrics. But I still feel like if you are, personally attached to an organization anyway, there is a personal skew potentially. I think the point about does the local community want it to continue? That's a really good measure. But I also think, and maybe you're right, maybe it isn't in those initial stages, the independence of an auditor is crucial.
Absolutely bringing in that non-biased view in terms of evaluating what's actually happening. I fully agree.
Okay, great. Well, this is a really coherent meeting we've had here.
I feel like we should have brought in some other stakeholders to disagree.
But potentially, I mean, if we were going to do a social impact startup, then maybe we need to bring in some people with some slightly differing views. But it's been a fun exercise nonetheless. I've really enjoyed it. I hope our business really flies and succeeds. I'll take on the bulk of the sales work and try and get us some startup money. Before we wrap up, is there anything in this conversation that you think we've overlooked, that we've we haven't considered? And this will be my last question, then I'll let each of you have a go at it.
We need to figure out what the company's selling, right? In working with our experience, or my experience in working with brands, is for investment, financial and non, to keep coming, their bottom line needs to be increasing as well. So I think making sure that we're not forgetting about that, that's also important, right? Like the whole selling of the business side to drive revenue also is making sure that's aligned, which you popped on the beginning. But we kind of skipped a lot of the nitty gritty of the actual, how do you get some of the revenue?
Well, we can go for another hour if you want, mate, but Katie?
That was what I was going to say. Same as Gunnar, was the commercial elements. And I think one of the things that is really lacking at the moment is there are brilliant anecdotal stories, like I said at the beginning, around the commercial benefits of marketing through doing social impact models. And there are some surveys. I mean, I know there's a Nielsen survey that shows that authentically addressing sustainability can increase commercial revenue by 11%. But there also isn't a wider study around this. So I'd look at really documenting what we're doing, ensuring that, it is working commercially, because there is certainly scope for it to do so, and figuring out why if it's not. But also thinking beyond ourselves as an organisation. So that kind of piece of research or monitoring would be really helpful more widely, because then, of course, it would drive more activations like this. Could it be replicated elsewhere? What frameworks do we use so that we're not reinventing the wheel? We're transparent about what has or hasn't worked, but it can also be used elsewhere, so that it goes beyond our own scope.
I know a newsroom that would be really willing to cover it. I might work there. I think that's probably all we've got time for. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I actually really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you did too.